Welcome to Divorced from Reality with Johnny Bardine.
Hello and welcome to Divorced from Reality with Johnny Bardine. Johnny has a mission to help Tampa Bay individuals and families through the most challenging times of their lives, doing so with compassion, fierce advocacy, and efficiency. And it's something he does every day. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is the typical flow of a divorce in Florida, the process and what to expect. Johnny, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Kevin, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so to start, can you briefly explain what the, quote unquote, typical divorce process looks like in Florida?
Yeah, so the quote unquote part is important because I try to tell my clients they need to divorce themselves from any expectation as to what a typical divorce looks like, and they need to avoid comparing themselves to other people that know who've gone through a divorce.
Right.
So that's in terms of like the emotional temperature and the direction that some of the cases take. But the process is generally the same, or should be the same. So it begins with the filing of the divorce petition, which sets forth the names of the parties, any minor children there are, assets and liabilities that need to be divided, or any request for alimony. So that gets filed in the circuit court. The other party, the respondent, the other spouse, gets served with that and has 20 days to answer and file a potential counterclaim. And so after that, after the petition and the answer are both filed, then the parties get together their financial disclosure, which sets forth their income, their monthly expenses, their assets and liabilities, and exchange it between the parties. And then after that, the parties typically go to mediation to try to resolve this. And mediation is going to be required in most instances before the court takes any intervention. And so if we settle it in mediation, then that's great. We can reduce it to writing and get the judge to stamp on it. If not, then we'll have a better idea of how far or close the parties are and how much more litigious it's going to be. And then the court will ultimately decide that.
Interesting. So mediation is not an option in that scenario.
Right. It's going to be required in all cases. In fact, most judges won't enter in any sort of temporary relief until the parties attend mediation.
Oh, wow. Okay. I've heard of mediation. I didn't know, depending on the state, probably that sometimes it's required and sometimes it's not.
That's correct. In terms of time, mediation occurs generally about 90 days after the filing of the divorce.
Okay. And what's the first step someone should take when they're thinking about getting a divorce in Florida? Should they consult an attorney like you right away, or are there things they can try to do on their own first?
I think it makes sense to schedule a consult with an attorney early on in that process who can help try to guide you through some of the practical issues that you need to do to get squared away before the filing of the divorce. So often, I've spoken to a couple clients this week who are still living with their spouse and want to avoid how awkward it could possibly be to go through a contentious divorce while still living with their spouse.
Yeah. And
so they wanted to talk to me about sort of practical ways to extricate that from their situation and the timing thereof and things like that they need to do before they dive headlong into an anxiety-inducing legal process.
Yeah. Anxiety-inducing indeed, for sure. Yeah. Once someone has decided to file for divorce, what documents and paperwork are involved in the filing process? I think you touched on it a little bit before, but can you go over that in detail?
Sure. So on our end, we need to draft the petition, which is a fairly simple document in theory, but it puts forth the parties' names, what assets and liabilities they might have, or a brief description of those, whether there are any minor children involved and the initials and birth dates of those children, and whether there's a claim for spousal support. On the client's end, they need to start gathering certain financial documents that are going to help us prove up the case and that are going to be required to be disclosed in this case. So those are the client's pay stubs, if there are any, bank statements, if there are any, credit card statements, stock certificates, deeds to properties, titles to motor vehicles, statements of investment accounts, and things like that are going to help them show what the assets and liabilities are that need to be divided and the relative income of the parties, which is going to be necessary for the computation of child support and the calculation of spousal support or alimony.
Okay. After the divorce petition is filed, I believe you said there's a waiting period. How long is the waiting period?
After the divorce is filed and served, by law, rules of civil procedure, the other party has 20 days to file a response.
Okay.
If they don't file a response, they have exposure of getting the case decided by default, which means the petitioner will get largely what they asked for.
Oh, okay. So it kind of ruins your chances or it impedes your chances to, fight for what you want.
Right. It's important to take those deadlines seriously and file your response within the prescribed deadline.
Okay. And how does the division of assets and debt typically work in Florida during a divorce?
That area of law is called equitable distribution, and it's governed by statute, Florida statute. And the presumption is that the assets and liabilities are going to be equitably divided by the party. But if you have a good reason, you can plead the court for unequal distribution. And so where that is typically in play is when there's been an intentional dissipation of the marital assets by one of the parties. So if they've secreted assets or encumbered debt or bought land without the knowledge or authorization of the other party, they can often be saddled with that debt inequitably because of what they did to dissipate the marital assets.
Are there any other factors that the court considers when making decisions about division of assets? Like if somebody wants to claim to get more, basically?
Another way that the intentional dissipation of marital assets is important is if there's an adulterous affair in the relationship. So if one party used marital assets to further the affair, otherwise they're buying hotel rooms or gifts for their other partner, then I think that how that affects them is in the award of alimony, put them on the hook for more exposure with regard to spousal support if they've used marital assets to further the affair.
Okay, and that's a good segue to my next question. How is alimony or spousal support handled in Florida? I understand there were some major changes last year, correct?
Correct. So unlike child support, which is formulaic, the calculation of alimony is very subjective. And so the analysis for spousal support is one party's need versus the other party's ability to pay it. And so we'll look at the deficiency in the disparity between the party's income, the deficit each month that a party has meeting their financial obligations, the level to which they were supported during the marriage, and what they did during the marriage. For example, if they raised one party's kids while the other spouse was able to go to med school, those are factors the court are going to consider when they determine alimony. The change in the law that you referenced occurred in the summer of 2022, and it did away with what we often think of as alimony, which is a periodic permanent alimony, which is a check every month until the other party remarries or dies. So for a long time, parties were entitled to that ostensibly if they were married in a long-term marriage, which is 17 years or longer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The Florida statute has now abolished that. So there's no longer an entitlement or an ability to get periodic permanent alimony. So what's left is durational alimony or bridge the gap or something like that that's short of periodic permanent alimony.
Okay, so then with that change, how is the duration of alimony calculated?
So that was also affected by the recent change in statute. And the length of the duration that alimony can be awarded depends on the length of the marriage. There's sort of 3 levels of that, and they all terminate upon the death or remarriage of the other party.
Okay.
For a short-term marriage, the durational alimony can only last up to 50% of the length of the marriage. And to say a short term, we mean 10 years or less.
Okay.
If there's a moderate-term marriage, that can only last 60% of the length of the marriage. And for a long-term marriage, durational alimony can only last up to 75% of the length of the marriage.
Interesting. Do you know why that law changed, or?
Well, look, it had been coming up in the legislature almost every session that the legislature had, and had failed or had not been, or had passed the legislature and not been signed by the governor. So It's something that people have been looking at for a long time. And I think the reason is to address sort of the changing social and cultural dynamics of both parties working in a marriage or ability to retire comfortably. And I think it's trying to address some of those things that have changed over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, society changes. Sometimes you got to make changes to the laws for sure. So we touched on child custody a little bit earlier, but can you just talk about how Florida law approaches child custody in divorce cases?
Sure. So that's also in the same legislative session. That was also addressed with the legislature, and the law has changed on that. So before that, what was controlling were the best interest factors, which are found in Florida Statute 61.13. And there are 20 factors that determine the time sharing of the parties with their children based on their engagement with the children, good or bad a parent they were, their time with the children, a number of factors that went into that. It's very subjective. And so as a result, judges, based on, I think, their own experience and their own time practicing law, were sort of all over the board with the time sharing, and there would be no predictability. But what the Florida legislature did was change so that there's now a presumption of equal time sharing between the parties. So when we start a case, there's a presumption that each party is going to have equal time sharing with their children. And the needle can be moved on that when we then analyze it against the best interest factors, which still exist. So we start at 50-50, and then if you get very good reasons, you can move off of 50-50 so that one party has a majority. That law hasn't been around that long. So it's been difficult to determine what that means on an appellate level. So there have not been a lot of cases that have tested that yet. Mm-hmm. So it's unclear yet about how judges have handled certain situations. But now the presumption is that each party is going to have equal time sharing with their children.
What common misconceptions do you run across when it comes to child custody and how it's decided?
You get some people who still have a contention that there's such a thing as a mother's state, in which the divorce cases are going to favor the mother. And then conversely, you've got some male clients who come in and talk about father's rights or men's rights. And equally, those don't exist either. So the law isn't set up to favor either a mother or a father. It's set up to gauge what's in the best interest of the minor children, and the court, that's the controlling consideration the court is going to have. Whether the parties are a mother and a father, or two mothers or two fathers, it doesn't matter. So we analyze it against the law, and I think one of the common misconceptions is that the court is going to favor one of the spouses over the other.
Yeah, I mean, mom has more power in that situation. I remember hearing that when I was a kid. You know what I mean? Like when you talk to friends or something about divorce or whatever, whenever it come up, it was always like, yeah, mom gets the kids, always.
And that may have been true then. It is not true now.
Yeah. So how is the child support calculated?
Right. So there's a objective formula, and it's found in the calculation of something called the child support guidelines. And so what that does in very simple terms is that it takes each party's net monthly income and analyzes that across a matrix for the overnights that each parent has with the kids. And then can be offsetting considerations if one party is paying for the healthcare costs or the childcare costs of the children. But you go through that formula and it spits out a number, and more often than not, that's what the child support is going to be.
Wow. All right. It's based on a formula. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. What are some of the common mistakes or pitfalls that you see that people make when they go through a divorce? You know, especially if they're trying to handle it on their own.
I'm glad you asked him that. I told a client this week, I'm like, look, in a divorce, there are 3 or 4 things that matter, and then a bunch of other noise. And listen to the other noise, you're going to get distracted, and you're not going to do very well in the case. So what I think one of the common mistakes that clients make going through a divorce is engaging in some of the ugliness and the muck with the other parent, which I think distracts from what should be the goal, which is getting through this process in a way that's going to leave you guys able to better care for yourselves and your children moving forward after the divorce. But instead, what you see is good people at their worst being mean to each other, yeah, which creates an oftentimes irreparable fissure to move forward together. Because you were a family once, and you're still a family now, just a different kind.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. It's a really good way to look at it. For someone who might just be starting out the process of divorce, you know, kind of maybe piggybacking off what you just said, what advice do you give them to help prepare emotionally, financially, or legally?
That's a really good question. And I touched on this in the first couple episodes of this podcast, which is you've got to do what you can to shore up your own mental health, which means strengthening your community and having some people to talk to about this, getting yourself into therapy if that's going to be a right fit for you, working with the other party to get the child into therapy if that could work for them, because these are very emotional and expensive times. And so the lawyer can fix a lot of those issues, but they can't fix all of them. They need to do some things that are going to keep them, the client needs to do things that are going to have to keep them healthy throughout the process, which can be unpredictable, long, and expensive.
Yeah. Do you find it's difficult sometimes to balance that, you know, trying to help someone when they're being maybe excessively emotional?
I wouldn't say I find it difficult, but I do think that client management and client expectations is a difficult part of the job. You know, I think I'm a different kind of lawyer in that I take a macro view of those issues. So if I see someone who's struggling emotionally or needs some help in some other ways that aren't particularly just about the divorce, then I'm going to go out and try to fix them, because they're going to be better clients and better people if they can sort of address those problems as early as they arise.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good point. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in to Divorced from Reality with Johnny Bardine. To connect with Johnny, you can head to bardinelawfirm.com, and please like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review in the comments. We'd appreciate it. Johnny, it was great to talk to you. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Kevin. See you soon.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.